Welcome to the Leadership with Biana Kovic Show, and thank you for being with us. Our topic, leadership, focuses on leaders such as yourselves. We believe that leadership is a skill that can be learned through practice and awareness. It is our hope that our conversation will help you become more reflective when it comes to your own leadership practices and enable you to leave a positive legacy. Our very special guest is Mualimm. Five is the Executive Director of Incarcerated Nation Network. He is a post-incarcerated human rights defender with ACLU and TRUA of Human Rights Watch. As a consultant to the United Nations Subcommittee on Torture, Five is a member of the United Nations OPCAT. Ever since his return to society, Five has worked to end state-funded torture and practices of punishment like solitary confinement and juvenile injustice. Five, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Five, I am very excited to have you on my show. You are the human rights defender and the executive director of Incarcerated Nation. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and about your organization.
Yes, Incarcerated Nation is a collective of post-incarcerated leaders, all who operate and run projects who serve people directly impacted, that means people in prison and their families, and work with youth as an alternative to incarceration. But we're an umbrella of over 400 projects over 50 states, and we all work collaboratively to make other projects, and those projects are mentoring projects. I'm also a human rights defender because I'm on the United Nations Subcommittee Against Torture. I've been appointed to that as a consultant. I work with Juan Mendez on the Anti-Torture Initiative, and I'm also a member of TRUA, Human Rights Watch, the rabbinical call for human rights.
So when we talk about incarceration, a lot of people don't know that you've been incarcerated for a number of years. Can you tell us about your experience?
So I was incarcerated for 12 years. I was sentenced to 32 to life. I was released after 12 years because they locked up all of the cops, the entire police department that locked me up. Because at the time, in the 90s, Reagan cut community-based funding for mental health facilities, but he also cut community-based funding for local law enforcement. And so the war on drugs has impacted this country. There's always been a vehicle to arrest poor people of color, but it also allows poor people who work in law enforcement to have to rely on the money that they catch to run their operations. And so at that time, it was the intersection of the war on drugs. And if your town didn't have a problem, you better create one in order to get funding. And so a lot of the work that I do is based on a personal experience. I do a ton of work on solitary. I was incarcerated for over 5 years in solitary confinement, and then released directly to the streets where I had a panic attack and actually went back and got violated on solitary, and they had me do old box time. And from that point, I returned home and have been kicking butt ever since then. And so legislative approach, services, collaborative help to help the family adjust with the punishment of the other person in prison, all of that incorporates a sort of team and network of people who are understanding. And so we also have to educate. And so we do a lot of work around human rights because incarceration in America, we have 2.5 million people in prison, and 80% of those people are people of color. The majority of those people are there for substance abuse charges,
So let's talk about solitary because, folks who are not familiar with that, for us solitary, you have to be a really bad guy. But that wasn't your case to be in solitary.
No, I was in there for nonviolent rule infractions. In 2010, I worked with the ACLU to do a boxed-in report. At that time, they had shown that 5 out of 6 people were in solitary for nonviolent rule infractions, meaning disciplinary infractions breaking some sort of inner system rule from the jail.
So what will be the rules that you can break?
Well, there's a booklet of over 100 rules and regulations. A lot of people don't remember them all. And it's really a system of prison economics because you're billed every time you're giving a ticket for $25. And so that surcharge helps the facilities run. And so they have other separate facilities that are housed for people to stay within one cell. And so the whole facility has 200 cells where people are sort of caged alone by themselves, suffering in isolation. And that's what solitary confinement is. Let me give you an example. I went to solitary for a horde of reasons: unauthorized exchange, possession of stolen property, hoarding, destruction of state property, and possession of multiple weapons. And you would look at those charges, how they're written, and say, wow, maybe this person needs to be separated or segregated from general society because he appears to be dangerous. Until you really get into how those ruled infractions happen, well, in prison, there's no talking in New York State. And so even if you're sentenced and you're locked in a cage right next to someone else, you're suffering in silence. And so the guy next door to me. He gets magazines. He's like, "Hey, Five, how you doing? My wife keeps sending me these Black Enterprise magazines. I'm a white guy from Buffalo. You want these?" And he passes me the magazines. Now, they have his numbers on it. And so I had an unauthorized exchange charge and a possession of stolen property because I'm not supposed to have his stuff. The reason why I was possessing of stolen property is because they asked me, "Well, he gave it to you, right?" Because if I told him that he gave it to me, he's going to go to the box too. Destruction of state property. I live in the 6th floor and a 46 cells on that one tier, 6 floors up. And we fish, which is a sort of technique to pass things from cell to cell and rip up your sheet. You do that. I had 2 pillowcases and 52 stamps. So I had 2 postage stamps over the allowed limit. And the last thing was written up as weapons were 12 sharpened wooden objects, basically sharpened pencils, because I do artwork and I did portraits. And so we see these sort of tickets to keep solitary confinement full as a system of perpetual punishment, but also as a system and a way to hurt people in the prison system who are already sentenced.
Let's talk about mental health, because there is a huge impact on the mental health when you're in a solitary.
Yes. A person like me should have never been in solitary confinement. I had a visit from Jeff Aubrey, who was one of the assemblymen in New York State at the time. And he wrote a bill called the Shoe Exclusion Law that said people with mental health and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder should never spend one day inside a solitary confinement, but more or less years and years on end. And so when I was released, I had a case against the city, and I was the first person declared mentally disabled because of solitary confinement. And so a housing unit was built for Micah, for people coming home, and I've sort of helped advocate and change that with Phipps Community. I still live in that housing unit, and so supportive housing is needed for people returning home who may have deteriorated from solitary confinement, especially leaving directly from that environment right into society. I went from a 6x9 closed cell looking like Dr. Jonathan Kimball, the fugitive, and dropped off 42nd Street, Times Square, 20 million commuters, Spider-Man fighting the Statue of Liberty. I had a panic attack. There was too many people around me, and that led to me being violated and sent back. And so we see that people react to incarceration and then are punished for those reactions.
Let's talk about reintegration, what our legal system needs to do for reintegration to be successful for folks who were incarcerated.
Reintegration has to be understood that it's a longer process. It is not just the exit from prison like in movies and I'm out now and I'm free and I'm okay and everything's back to normal. No, you have so much social oppression. You have so much rules and regulations and laws that apply to you post-incarceration. So it seems like your sentence is perpetual punishment. One, felony disenfranchisement. Being a felon, you're locked out from resources like housing. You can't get an FHA first-time homebuyer's loan. Your credit is down. You can't even get housing in some sense because you haven't been homeless. Even though you've been in prison for 15 years, you've been in a state of reward. So the money from your county where you went to prison left and went to the county with you. And so this is called gerrymandering, right? This process takes a time to reverse. And this is why the average stay in the shelter is 2 or 3 years before you're even placed into housing. And then you move into a city like New York that 66,000 people homeless every night, and you're at the bottom of that list. And so I believe housing disenfranchisement and felony disenfranchisement itself, which also started in New York State, really impacts reintegration. So it's a longer process. Like you're going to take 45 days before you can get your health care initiated. It's going to take you 12 to 18 months before you can get housing 2010 application into the system. Not approved, not you're moving into an apartment. That's just your first year in the shelter. The second year is when they start helping you. And so with these timelines, I believe that reintegration is a longer process, right? The state gives some organizations re-entry funding. Like, here's money to give that person a Metro card that first day they come home. That's it. That's all you're getting. And so if you have persistent mental health, you're held longer because your medication and sort of how you're going to be placed, they're not going to release you until then. So that extends your sentence. And so mental health becomes this sort of punishment in prison. It's saying, oh, well, you have mental disabilities and you have mental health concerns. So we're not going to release you just yet. And so you'll stay past your sentence. You'll spend longer in the shelter. You'll linger fat longer. And with that, reintegration has to be understood that it takes people who are knowledgeable on the needs of the person coming home. And so the best people to do reintegration is people who have reintegrated successfully. And so one of the many projects that we created was the Reaper Project, the re-entry advocate position. And that means people who have been previously incarcerated should be the person helping that person come home. it's sort of easier to have a person who's experienced with the trials and tribulations, what works, what doesn't work. Don't go over here. Don't waste your time over here. Go over here. They're going to help you get you this. This is what a person needs to hear. And it's just a little bit more comfortable when it's a person who has the same direct experience than you do. And so reintegration is a process of returning to society to not even equal rights, but to dealing with a whole new sets of disenfranchisement rights.
And let's talk about the impact on families, because there is obviously a huge impact, right? And you had a son when you were incarcerated. Can you talk to us about what did your family go through?
Well, I have 3 sons and a daughter, and it's hard. My daughter has 0 relationship with me. She doesn't want to speak to me. I mean, when I came home, she was 13, and I was locked up for 12 years. And so basically her entire life. And being shifted around from city facility to state facility to federal facility, it's been hard. And so with my other sons, we actually had to create a program. We created another project called POPS, where we speak about fatherhood with StoryCorps and those gaps we missed. When I came home, my first son, who was a huge activist and photographer and designs clothes with B-Wood and Supreme, my son was upset with me. And we had a little distance. And I think that when we agreed to move further as men, we noticed that other families were always coming into our office, always distraught. Moms are coming home. Their kids were in foster care for the 10 years that they were in prison. Their children are fighting them and mad at them because when you come home after 10 years, you owe me 10 years of birthdays or you've missed this amount of time. And I think it was my son reading up on a punishment that he felt like he was in prison as well. And we wrote an article on Solitary Watch called Double Celled. And he said that he felt like he was imprisoned as I was in prison. And reintegration really is difficult with your family, and the impact is because prison is not an open book. It is not some place you can drive up to in a country club and just walk in and visit your mom. Letters are restricted, contact is restricted, communication is restricted, and you may be in a state where you may never physically see your parents again or see your children or touch them. It becomes a miss. My son explained to me a lot of things that didn't really hit me, like parent-teacher night. What's happening when he has only one sex of a parent to talk to, his mom? He can't talk to her about hormonal rage and having a girlfriend and relationships and what should he do when he's harassed by the police because of my activism or the work that we've done. But the fact that his grandparents are Black Panthers and that's looked at in this country as a negative hindsight to be a freedom fighter for Black lives. And all of these things are constantly going in his life when, in my mind, I'm thinking my absence may just be it. No, the absence of a parent, a parental unit, is half of a child's personality. He really makes himself up of how he acts with mom and how he acts with dad. And that's like sort of how he becomes who he is. And he hasn't had that. He's been robbed of that. And then there's a constant attack on children. The Rosenberg Fund pays for my kids' psychotherapy because they are harassed. I have a son who's 16. He has been arrested 14 times since he's been 12 years old because of my activism. And so these repercussions happen to families. While you're doing your 10, 15 years in prison away from society, the family's combating society. And then the other thing is that in New York State and most of the states in this country, because of Bill Clinton's TANF system, you're disenfranchised because of your child's or your family member's arrest. And so when I was arrested, my family suffered. They couldn't live in public housing. They had to be moved. They were removed from getting public assistance. And imagine you have a nephew or a cousin or a family member that you don't know. And so if they're arrested or incarcerated, you're impacted as well. And you're like, wait a minute, I haven't seen Cousin Jay in like 15 years. They're like, well, you're getting kicked out of housing because he was locked up in Queens. And you're like, well, I live in Brooklyn. And they're like, yeah, this is the law.
So essentially, it impacts not only immediate family, but impacts family overall.
Families, communities, businesses in the neighborhood. Where are you working at? How is that employment going to be handled? Everybody has to adjust to compensate for your absences. And then 10 years later, you're coming home exonerated because the charges were falsely claimed. Or 5 years later, you're coming home because they locked up all of the cops and you're finally being let out of solitary. Like, these issues happen every day. And that's horrible.
So how do you move on?
Well, a lot of people come home and they want to help. They want to give back. They want to create a system. They want to fight back. Look at Piper. Piper came home. This is my good friend. She did time in prison. She also wrote a book. Her book was published. It was turned into a TV show. Orange is the New Black won constant Emmys. And now people can understand how women are impacted in prison. Now people can understand in private prisons and how forced labor and all these things apply. Shackling while birth, or if you're LGBTQ, you're tortured in solitary. Like, these conditions happen because people's narratives are talking about it. But it had to be her love and her respect for the people that she left behind time to do something to shine light into that. And so I think that's the difference. People are coming home saying, wow, I just left slavery and we have to stop this in America. And they become activists. And so organizing and educating, but also creating that platform. And so Incarcerated Nation has a whole support system. We train people, we teach them about technology and sort of the computer equipment that they've been missing for 10 or 15 years in order to organize and run their own business. We help them incubate, incorporate, and then we also create workshops where they can facilitate classes based on their own experience. And so we have workshops on punishment, to parole, to how it is to be incarcerated, to the food, everything, so that people and family members can come up and show up and sort of at these free events and learn about what their family members going through.
I have another question. What are your thoughts on Hollywood movies? Do you think it helps out the case or it's not helping the case?
I believe that they're just chasing what's new. We've been doing this human rights work for years, and now that media is sort of infringing in our world and our world becomes a subject of topic, I think it's also a sort of unrecognized push from the back. So I have been doing productions, TV shows, movies for 7 to 10 years now. And that's because we need to get the truth out there on every level. So I've done documentaries, articles, movies, virtual reality apps, TV shows. I've written whole segments, produced whole segments, directed whole segments. The purpose is to get it out and get that these people are suffering, and narratives based from people's voices. Far too often, people are used and someone else is playing their role, or someone else is playing your pain. Like we just did the Escape from Dannemora. Did it with Ben Stiller, set production. They won a whole Emmy for it. They won 19 Emmys for set. But I cast it like Ben Stiller asked us, hey, we're going to pay you to train these guys to act like they're in prison. I'm like, no disrespect, but they would never act like they're in prison. And why would I do that? I have 350 people that I could hire that just left this exact prison. And so if you want authenticity, let me put the person who just left this cell, who's right now living in Brooklyn, right back in that cell to play himself. And that's what I did. We casted 350 actual people who are in the facility. And so when people watched that show, they were like, oh, dude, that's Gary. Like I was actually there with him. And so it also gave those people directly impacted a chance to be themselves and not be exploited. And so I think the media world is shifting because they want direct experience in some sense. You have to understand, in this country, there's 325 million Americans, approximately. Over 125 million Americans are previously incarcerated. That's 1/3 of the American population who have been cycled through the prison system. And so you're missing an entire audience if you're not talking about them. You're missing an entire audience if you don't relate to the things that are still impacting their lives today as they survive in this country post-incarcerated. And so that is the audience that the media needs. Like I had this conversation with Bill Moyers. I did a documentary called Rikers in American Jail with Bill Moyers, and he was like, "5, I'm the whitest white guy you'll meet." And he is. He had white hair. His teeth was white. He was just white as heck. He also is the public square, sort of Channel 13 PBS WNYT king. And for him, he was saying, you need to do this on PBS. And I'm like, I want to do it with HBO first because I've been working with them for so long. He's like, look, people will deny the truth. And HBO and WNYT does a lot of research and back data themselves to make sure that there's authenticity. So we actually had to subpoena everybody's records to put into this documentary. But it was a huge success. It really debunked a lot of myths. And when people said that's not true, PBS was like, well, we have a whole bunch of POV educators that did this research and says it is. So I think it's the way that you do media. And so Bill Moyers, he literally said, this is the last thing I'm going to do before I retire, but I have to expose this. And then he retired, of course. And I think it's a necessary need to give people the undying truth. And there will always be doubt. But I think the more that we talk about it, the more that we educate people, the more that other citizens are saying, why am I paying this much? Why am I paying for this person to be incarcerated? Matter of fact, this whole state would be cheaper. Like the governor said, we would have free education if we closed Southport or upstate. 2 of the 56 facilities that live in New York State. And we pay $76 million for only 2 of them.
So, some people would say to you, okay, so if we close prisons, what do we do? Where do we put all these people that might have to go to prison?
Well, one, we don't need 3, 2, 3, 4, 5 million people in prison. That's just ridiculous. Some of these jails and most of these prisons, like Rikers Island, I think people don't understand the details of the facts. The facts is no one has ever committed a crime. They're just all arrested for detainment. That's it. They're detainees waiting for court, waiting for trial. Why? Because we have this system of just locking up people of color, Spanish and Black people all the time in certain communities. We have a concentration of offices only in the Black community. That creates this sort of perpetual cycle where Rikers was 30,000 people any given day. And we started really debunking that because of media, because of access, because of the ability to expose the fact that, why are you here? Oh, I was crossing the street. Wait a minute, you're locked up for jaywalking? Well, the officer said something to me, and then when I said I didn't care about him, and he locked me up. And then you look like, oh, all these people are here for non-violent offenses. Then you go to ask the officer, oh, well, there's a system of pro-ratio performance and comp stat that says I have a quota. Like, I have to lock these people up. And so I think that in New York, like, especially all the stop and frisk and the rules and stuff that came out of that, and the exposure of the pressure of the system to get this sort of money and get this ticket money and lock these people up was unjustified. We had 650,000 people in the South Bronx area in the Morris area stopped and frisked in 6 months. That is ridiculous. And like, if you look at the movie we made, Crime and Punishment, about the 25 officers who actually stood up, these bold heroes were like, why are you telling me to go out and lock up people of color if they didn't do anything just to make a quota? These are officers who are bold enough to say, I didn't join the police department to do that. I joined to fight crime. And then more officers and more officers and more officers came out. And so it's just still an ongoing issue. But I think that we're changing the narrative because it always has been these people. You know, that's what genocide is. You associate a problem with the person, and then it's not too hard to start abusing and checking and running down and searching that person. And then you start taking that person's property. It's not too hard to then just start turking that person. And so I believe that we have labeled some people in society, the bottom 10%, the poor people, as disposable people. Let's find a way to just lock them up. As a matter of fact, if we could find a way of locking them up and just keeping them away, as a matter of fact, if we could find a way of locking them up, keeping them away and making $1 off of it, society will be better for it. And so I don't believe we need 2-3 million people in jail. But tearing down the prison industrial complex structure, no, you should not be making products in prison to support society at a cost. Because the consumer is just paying for it, right? You're paying for the prison. You're paying for that person being incarcerated. You're not getting justice. The only justice America or the country is giving you is saying, if this person hurts you, we'll just disappear them. We'll take them away too. And that's difficult.
I know your parents were part of Black Panthers.
Yes.
And your mom passed away in jail.
Yes.
Can you talk to us about it?
You know, my family came from Ethiopia when I was young. They came over here to make a better life and then realized, oh, we're people of color, we have to fight. And they created programs like the free breakfast program for kids and for youth to eat breakfast before they go to school because people in the Black community didn't. The sanitation departments didn't come through the Black community to pick up trash. So they got together with the other Latino immigrants and created their own garbage control system. They created their own medical checks. They went house to house and tested each other for HIV and Hep C because poor people of color and Latinos weren't allowed, wasn't looked at as people. They didn't have human rights. And so this was considered the greatest threat back. Domestic terrorism, how dare you do after-school programming? How dare you create food programs? And they were attacked. And then they had the right to bear arms. Did they walk around in guns? No, they mostly did cop watch because cops would just pull over people of color and just beat them senseless. And they had to fight against other gangs like the coon hunters and the rabbit hunters and the black spades and other groups and organizations that were oppressing people of color. And so as a survival program, they created food pantries, food, allowed themselves to do distribution for help. They bartered. They had stores where you could trade. You didn't have to shop for money if you had a skill or if you was able to volunteer. This is a very hard time in New York City, but also in California. And people of color were still being hung, lynched, still being dragged off and abused by white gangs. And then the white gangs were caught and then released like today. And so the Black Panthers were a nationalist group around Americanism, to be America. They said, we're fighting against Americans to be Americans in America. And as Panthers, I'm still doing this work. Most of my work is to help the younger people, which the Panthers were. They were all teenagers. You know, my father always told me that when he was young, they said, don't trust nobody over 30 because they were all so young. And these were just young kids who took their destiny in their hand and said, you know what? We're just not going to sit back and get killed. We're going to stand up and do something about this. As a matter of fact, we're just going to create the programs we need. And so the Panthers had over 52 programs, from education to political education to voting to home ec to community cleaning to certain diseases and keeping up medical appointments because people of color weren't allowed to have health insurance. And so my mom was arrested for sending raincoats and socks back to Israel because that's where she's from. And she was locked into solitary where she had diabetes and she had an infection in her toe, ingrown toenail, and he amputated a toe, then a foot, then her leg. And my mom died in perpetual punishment in solitary. And yes, this was a very long time ago, but look at today, you can still hold a person from another country indefinitely. We created a whole project about it called No Separate Justice with Justice Mazzola and Amnesty International. And it really highlights the same problem like they killed my mother, that you can hold a person because they're from another country without any charges, without any evidence, using the testimony of someone else to indict them. And that person's, do they have an incentive to testify? Oh, well, they're getting out of jail for doing it. And so it becomes this sort of ransom system that we're constantly taking one person and using poor person to condemn another poor person.
And what would you say to folks who just say, 5, I just don't know what I can do about it?
You can do anything. So I have a letter writing program. I have programs that you can just post and tweet. Like, everybody can do something. This is sad. If you're not being impacted by it, you're paying for it. And so I think under that system, it impacts everybody. It charges one person for protection. And you say, you know what? I'm glad we have jails or prisons in this town, because if anything happens to me, that's where that person can go. Until you're like, why do I have to pay so much for school? Why am I paying so much for this? Why is it costing me so much for this? Because the financial encumbrance of the person being in jail and their disenfranchisement is on you. Well, then why is my community not getting any better when that person was taken? Oh, when that person was taken, the money, to $50,000 to $70,000 to $80,000 that each person gets as a consensus for that community, leaves their community with them and goes to that rural town. And so I think as people start to understand how the incarceration impacts everybody, they're being knowledgeable, saying, well, how does this impact me? And then people have a right to be their own voice, right?
So we have to start to care.
Right. You have to start to care. And even if you care about yourself, even if you're saying, why am I paying so much in taxes? Why am I paying so much in this? Why am I paying for these prisons? People say I'm not directly impacted. Everyone is directly impacted. If you're not in prison, you're paying for it.
Any final thoughts?
Yes. Like I said, we incubate so many leaders. We've created 18 nonprofit projects in the last 2 years alone, over 50 in the last 5. And I think that they're successful running projects because there's so many needs still not being met.
And how can people contact you, invite you to speak?
5, F-I-V-E, at incarceratednation.org. We have a whole collective of experts from solitary to juvenile justice, to aging in prison, to parole, to food, to all kind of other social disenfranchisement. But people are experienced at every level. And if you need people to speak from experience, you can contact the Incarcerated Nation, because we represent 2.5 million people in prison and the over 100 million people who are previously incarcerated. That's an entire nation. And if you take all the prison and jails in America and put them together, that's a landmass the size of Texas, and that is in itself the Incarcerated Nation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Five, for being a guest.
Thank you.
Our special guest was Mualimm, the Executive Director of Incarcerated Nation Network. Thank you for tuning in and listening to the Leadership with Biana Kovic Show. Remember that you're all leaders in your own rights, and the impact that you're meant to achieve starts with small acts of kindness, curiosity, and generosity. Please give us a like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you again, and until next time.